Oh my god, the United Fruit Company was the devil. One of the more infuriating elements of adulthood is acknowledging how poorly constructed your education was. Major policies of your own government with significant modern implications are overshadowed by the fairy tale-esque telling of the Lewis and Clark journey for the 8th time. While reading the CIA in Guatemala, my frustration was so intense. Most of the notes which I wrote down in order to help me write this script were such poignant observations as stupid, so fucking stupid, and what the fuck. Guatemala, a small country in Central America, was a major focus of US foreign policy in the years immediately following World War II, because they did something that turned out to be unacceptable. Actually constructing policies to alleviate the suffering of their countrymen at the marginal expense of US business interests. To illustrate to you how this happened, we'll take a brief tour of the country from the 1931 election of Jorge Ubico to the overthrow of the revolutionary government. Following that, we'll take a look at the two policies that put the Guatemalan government in the crosshairs of the CIA. After that, a peek into the US ideology of the time and why on earth they thought this would be a good idea for anybody but themselves. Finally, taking stock of the US coup and its support for the brutal regimes that followed. In 1931, Jorge Ubico won the uncontested Guatemalan election. He would be the last leader of the pre-revolutionary regime. Ubico's reign is marked by his egotism and political corruption. He fancied himself another Napoleon, admired European fascists, made full surrender deals to American corporations, and committed murder to solidify his political power. The class he came from and the order he sought to protect were the wealthy landholding class, which despite being 2.2% of the population, owned 70% of the land. This economic caste system is further illuminated when one sees that 0.03% of farmers owned 50% of the arable land, and by sheer happenstance, the most fertile. Included in that 0.03% were foreign corporations, mainly the United Fruit Company, which, being concerned with its own profits, focused on export crops, mainly coffee and bananas. These two commodities accounted for 90% of Guatemala's agricultural output and forced most of the population to feed itself through expensive imports. The economic lopsidedness of this arrangement set the stage for the Revolution of 1944. On October 19th of that year, a small band of revolutionaries overthrew the Ubico regime, followed by a spontaneous demonstration by thousands of Guatemalans. The revolutionaries took advantage of the appalling conditions and repressive policies of the Ubico regime and affirmed themselves on the principles of democracy, economic development, and Guatemalan sovereignty, all seemingly reasonable principles. However, the two policies that turned out to be the most controversial in the US were the Land Reform Bill and the Labor Code. Both of these policies were implemented under the first president, Juan Jose Arevalo, and aggressively expanded under the second, Jacobo Arbenz. As previously mentioned, the ownership of land in Guatemala was concentrated in the hands of a few individuals and foreign corporations. The results were typical of such an arrangement: lack of investment in Guatemala, export crop agriculture, and widespread poverty. It was therefore necessary for the revolutionary government to challenge this economic order and find a way to fairly distribute the lands. The first observation the government made was that much of the land owned by the wealthy was not being cultivated. To be specific, about 75% or 3 million acres. With the vast majority of the population being poor, landless peasants, the government took the pragmatic route, seized the land, compensated the previous owners, and dispersed that land among the population. Once again, seems very reasonable. And in a big and warranted fuck you, the Guatemalan government compensated the previous owners by the value of the land recorded on tax forms, which of course was much lower than the actual value of the land. The United Fruit Company was compensated $1.185 million for 400,000 acres of land. Later, the United States, for the same land, issued a bill on behalf of the United Fruit Company to the tune of about $16 million. After years of robbing the Guatemalan people, these shameless oligarchs claimed discrimination under the Land Reform Bill and unfair compensation by the revolutionary government, branding them communists all along the way. And we must remember that this land reform program was very modest, especially given the social and economic climate, and its primary focus was on large land holdings that were not being cultivated. The other law that put the Guatemalan government in conflict with the United States interests was the Labor Code of 1947. These laws gave all kinds of protections to workers, including the right to collective bargaining, guidelines for improved working conditions, and rules for non-wage compensation like medical care. Of course, workers began to unionize, and that didn't sit well with the United Fruit Company. In one telling instance, Guatemalan strikers demanded their wage be increased to the obscene sum of $1.50 a day, access to free medical care, improved on-site housing, better working conditions, and paid time off in the event of sickness or injury. The United Fruit Company response? To threaten to shut down operations in Guatemala completely. The author Immerman takes a soft approach to criticizing the US coup in Guatemala, attributing it to the Cold War ethos and a profound misunderstanding of Guatemalan politics. He describes the Cold War ethos as dividing the world into those that are free and those that are communists. Through this lens, a communist was defined as anyone who opposed US interests. And by that axiom, we get a belief that still persists today, that what's in the interests of US elites is in the interest of all of humanity, with predictable results across Central America, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Immerman claims that because of this Cold War ethos, no collusion was necessary between the US government and the United Fruit Company. Where US economic interests were under attack, the US considered itself under attack. Communist paranoia sat parallel to US business interests. So, what was the actual communist threat? Communist-affiliated organizations numbered about 500 members in 1952 and up to 1,000 in 1953. They did capture a few seats in the National Assembly and were very active in the labor movement and land reform program, but I could find no evidence that they were any more than a small constituency in favor of the policies put forth by the revolutionary government. The US openly acknowledged that the communists had very little influence on the general population, even saying that they would make a great anti-communist asset. Additionally, as the documentary record gets closer to the coup, accusations of communist tolerance by the Arbenz regime transform into accusations of being captive to communist interests. Apparently, the case for this is so weak that the CIA advocates for the fabrication of evidence to advance this point of view at the Organization of American States Conference. Part of the problem is the paranoia of US administrators in labeling anyone who doesn't want to disenfranchise or destroy communists as communists, using phrases like crypto-communist, communist sympathizer, and fellow traveler. It also seemed to be an accepted truism that if they were communists, they must be taking orders from the Soviet Union, even though like every otherism there are vast differences of opinion on a variety of topics. And despite a frantic search, no Moscow connection could be found to the Guatemalan Communist Party, let alone the Arbenz government. It's difficult to figure out whether the US administrators really believed their half-baked ideas or were intentionally malicious. But either way, it's safe to say they didn't seek out a broader understanding. To illustrate their infantile approach, here's a description of the duck test by the ambassador to Guatemala, Richard Patterson. Many times it is impossible to prove legally that a certain individual is a communist, but for cases of this sort I recommend a practical method of detection, the duck test. The duck test works this way. Suppose you see a bird walking around in a farmyard. This bird wears no label that says duck, but the bird certainly looks like a duck. Also, he goes to the pond and you notice that he swims like a duck. Then he opens his beak and quacks like a duck. Well, by this time you have probably reached the conclusion that this bird is a duck, whether he's wearing a label or not. While Immerman tepidly concludes that the CIA coup came out of a misunderstanding, I think the evidence points more towards criminal neglect. When you run the most powerful force in the world, you are not allowed to use such ridiculous devices and ideological prescriptions when so many lives, as we shall see, are at stake. The coup, codenamed Operation PB Success, is a very interesting story which I invite you to research, but for the sake of our discussion, you only need to know that it was CIA planned and CIA backed. How we judge morally any nation, including the United States, is by interpreting the results of its actions. In Guatemala, the US supported the repressive Ubico. Though the US was not immediately hostile to the revolutionary government, it started drafting plans for the coup as early as 1951, even before the land reform program. After the overthrow of Arbenz came the dictator Castillo Armas. Under Armas, the land reforms were revoked, trade unions destroyed, the secret police re-established to combat communist subversives, and arbitrary imprisonment for an indefinite period of time came back into being, all with US backing. Then, from 1960 to 1996, a civil war took place, which in itself is a bit of a misnomer. It was not a war between two evenly matched sides. It was a fight between the US-backed dictatorships and left-wing guerrilla forces, with a 5-year break in U.S. military aid from 1977 to 1982 initiated by the Carter administration. The war left 200,000, primarily poor Mayans, dead or missing. Guatemala to this day is plagued with crime and corruption. The current administration has been called a crime syndicate by a UN prosecutor and is currently under investigation. I first want to acknowledge that I have no utopian perspectives on the revolutionary government in Guatemala. Arevalo and Arbenz were people with flaws and power, but they don't have to be perfect to do something good. By their words and deeds, they showed pragmatic and fair governance that was meant to coexist with foreign investment, and move towards an economic order which would benefit the majority of the Guatemalan people and bring the country into the industrial world. The complete rejection of moderate reforms by the US would color the revolutionary movements of Central and South America for the rest of the century. Regardless of what you think about Cuba, they learned very well from the historical case of Guatemala. Rather than negotiate with foreign corporations or the conservative wealthy class, they either killed them or kicked them out. I stumbled across the document NSC 68, which details general US foreign policy aims in 1950. There's a lot of talk in there about how the US role in the world is to defend its values, not its interests. We are commissioned to protect freedom, democracy, and tolerance. In light of how US foreign policy has proceeded in some way, even by some of the drafters of this document, I can only really take it two ways. Either it's a cynicism so thick you can taste it, or mind-blowingly ignorant. And that's the thing about criticizing US foreign policy. Some of our leaders seem pretty alright. They talk, even sometimes internally, with the right words and attitudes. But in the end, the political and economic always seem to trump any moral positions. They don't have to grow horns and produce an evil monologue in order to commit mass murder. They can kiss one baby and drop bombs on others. We have not had a great history of supporting democracies in spite of ourselves. Democracy is only allowed if it fits within the frame of US interests, which is sort of against the spirit of democracy. Coup d'etat was and still remains one of the primary tools we create client states, and we finance these regimes through military aid despite major breaches in human rights, up to and including murder and torture. So of course you can say, and I'll give you this, that the world's a giant heaping bag of shit and we have to get them before they get us. I don't agree. But I'll give you that. But please, for the love of God, drop the moral overtones and accept the bleak worldview you put forth. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in a couple weeks.